Can world conquest and apocalypse bringer Mynoghra? World conquest starts with the civilization of ruin ever be justified? This question requires a broader examination because the central conflict in the story is not built on a simple opposition between good and evil. From the beginning, the audience is not positioned as a neutral observer. Instead, they are placed directly within the perspective of a force that builds its civilization through processes that inherently harm others. As a result, judgment does not operate on universal moral standards but gradually shifts to align with the internal logic presented by the narrative. In conventional moral frameworks, world conquest is almost always considered unjustifiable. It involves coercion, loss of freedom, and the domination of territories and resources that originally belonged to others. Beyond that, conquest often leads to the collapse of existing social structures, including culture, identity, and long-established systems of life. Under such conditions, conquest directly contradicts principles of fairness and balance. However, within the context of Mynoghra, conquest is not portrayed as a freely chosen moral action that could simply be avoided. Instead, it functions as a fundamental mechanism for survival and expansion. The system that defines Mynoghra does not allow for growth through cooperation or peaceful adaptation. It can only develop by transforming, overtaking, and replacing existing systems. Under these conditions, conquest is not merely a strategy, but an inseparable component of its existence. This leads to a deeper question. Can an action be judged as wrong if it is the only available means of survival? If an entity has no alternative but to dominate in order to exist, then evaluating its actions using conventional moral standards becomes problematic. In this case, morality is no longer absolute but conditional, dependent on circumstances and limitations. Mynoghra is depicted as a civilization that does not pursue coexistence. It replaces rather than adapts. The environments it occupies are systematically altered to fit its needs, regardless of the consequences for what previously existed. This creates irreversible transformations, where other civilizations do not merely lose territory, but lose the possibility of returning to their original state. At the same time, every action taken within this process is presented as structured and deliberate. Nothing occurs randomly. Each decision follows a consistent system and serves a defined purpose. There is no reliance on emotional impulse. Instead, actions emerge from a calculated and coherent framework. This structured approach makes conquest appear rational even if it remains ethically questionable, yet rationality does not equate to moral correctness. The consequences of conquest remain significant and unavoidable. Those who are conquered lose autonomy, control, and often their very existence as independent entities. From this perspective, conquest remains a form of injustice, regardless of how organized or logical it appears. The narrative also demonstrates how perspective influences moral evaluation. By consistently presenting events through Mynoghra's viewpoint, the audience's focus gradually shifts. Attention moves away from the suffering of the victims and toward the intentions and reasoning of the conqueror. This shift does not happen abruptly, but through repetition and narrative consistency. As a result, actions that initially seem unacceptable begin to feel understandable. This illustrates that justification often does not arise from changes in the action itself, but from changes in how the action is perceived. When an action is explained with sufficient clarity and consistency, resistance toward it can diminish. The story does not attempt to deny the harm caused by conquest, but instead reshapes how the audience interprets the motivations behind it. On a broader level, this can be seen as a reflection of the relationship between power and legitimacy. In many contexts, those who hold power also influence how actions are judged. When a system succeeds in dominating and sustaining itself, its actions are more likely to be normalized, even if they were initially perceived as wrong. This suggests that justification is not always rooted in moral truth, but often in the stability of power. There is also a clear distinction between judging actions based on outcomes and judging them based on methods. Mynoghra prioritizes results. As long as its objectives are achieved, the methods become secondary. This stands in contrast to moral frameworks that consider the process as important as the outcome. The tension between efficiency and ethics becomes central, highlighting that effectiveness does not guarantee moral acceptability. From a broader analytical perspective, this situation indicates that morality is not always universal. What is considered acceptable within one system may be rejected in another. Mynoghra operates under a different set of principles, meaning its actions can only be fully understood from within its own framework. However, when judged externally, especially from the perspective of those affected, the evaluation changes significantly. Therefore, the question of justification cannot be answered with a simple conclusion. When viewed from the perspective of its impact on others, world conquest remains harmful and difficult to justify. No internal logic can fully erase the damage inflicted on those who are conquered. However, when examined within the system that drives it, the actions follow a consistent and understandable logic. The final outcome is not a clear declaration of right or wrong, but an exposure of how moral judgment is shaped. The narrative demonstrates that the perception of an action can shift depending on perspective, structure, and intent. The audience is left in a position where they can understand the reasoning behind conquest, while still recognizing its consequences. In this tension between understanding and judgment lies the core of the story. The question is no longer limited to whether the conquest itself is justified, but extends to how far one's moral boundaries can be influenced by perspective.